Hello and welcome back to A&P with Emily. What we're going to do today is moving on from the circulatory system, not moving on but keeping within lines of, we're going to be looking at blood pressure. So blood pressure, what is blood pressure and what can go wrong if your blood pressure falls or if it rises too much, and how your body deals with that before any kind of medical intervention. So what is blood pressure? What do we know about blood pressure? Blood pressure, we know, has essentially two parts to it. So we have a systolic rate, and it's over a diastolic. Okay, and it's measured in millimeters of mercury. Okay, got a blood pressure monitor, so that's very basics of it. So what actually is blood pressure? So blood pressure is the pressure of circulating blood against the walls of your blood vessels, so your arteries and your veins, mainly your arteries, okay? So that's what that means. And systolic is your heart pumping blood out, so the pressure of that. And your diastolic rate is the pressure when your heart rests in between beats. Okay. So it's the pressure of your circulating blood against the walls of your blood vessels. Now there are two factors that determine blood pressure, and that is peripheral resistance, which we will look at, don't panic too much at the words. That's also can be known as peripheral vascular resistance, and then you've got cardiac output, and all of these things link really nicely in together. So they're the two determining factors of blood pressure, okay? And we're going to have a look at peripheral resistance properly. So what is peripheral resistance? It is essentially how hard peripheral resistance is essentially just how difficult, how hard it is to pump blood around the body, okay? So how hard it is to push blood around this, the CVS, so the cardiovascular system as a whole, okay? Now going back to our other one, which is cardiac output. So cardiac output, there's actually an equation that we can do for that. So cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate, and that will give you cardiac output. All right. So what is stroke volume? Stroke volume is the volume of blood that's pumped from the left ventricle per heartbeat, okay? So we've got that, and then times our heart rate, we know how to get that, and that will give us our cardiac output, okay? I also want to look at what determines peripheral resistance. So if I just abbreviate a little bit here, so peripheral resistance, what determines that? What determines how difficult it is to pump blood around the body? So you will have the diameter of arterioles, mainly arterioles, but blood vessels in general. It will also be determined by vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Okay, all of those factors really affect what the peripheral resistance is and how hard it is to pump blood around the cardiovascular system. So let's have a look at what we would do, or what our body does, when we have low blood pressure or low blood volume, and when we have high blood pressure and high blood volume. You've probably heard of hypertension. And that is kind of a long-standing high blood pressure problem. A lot of older people suffer from hypertension and high blood pressure, so they're on medication accordingly, okay? So if we look at low and high blood pressure, I want to look at the two different responses that happen in the body. So we have a neural response and we have a hormonal response to both of these, okay? The neural response is picked up by receptors in your aorta and your carotids, and they are called baroreceptors. And they are like pressure receptors, so they detect either the drop or the raise in pressure from your blood pressure, and they will send a signal. So they'll send a electrical signal up via here into your medulla oblongata, which houses the majority of your involuntary actions of your body. So the things that we don't have to think about, like breathing, like heart rate, like everything like that, everything that we don't have to think about to do. So like, you know, we have to think about lifting our leg up, we have to think about talking, we don't have to think about breathing and all of our involuntary things. So that sends a signal to the medulla, and then the medulla is a bit like an integration center, so it decides what to do with that signal, and then it will send a response out to the rest of the body, and more importantly it will send a response out that will send a signal up to the voluntary center, which is the medulla oblongata, and then the medulla will send a response to that. So it will send a response to mainly your SA node, and if you have low blood pressure it will tell the SA node to speed up, so increase your heart rate, and if you have high it will act on the SA node to decrease your heart rate, so as to attempt to restore a normal blood pressure there, or at least bring it down or up from what it was. Now the hormonal response, I want to look at the hormonal response for low blood pressure to start with. And let's say, for example, you have low blood pressure due to lack of blood volume or general blood, so you're losing blood, or let's say you're dehydrated or something like that. So you have low blood pressure. If you've got low blood pressure, it means you've got low blood volume. And this low blood volume triggers a hormonal response in the body called the angiotensin response. Okay, and we're going to look at that in more detail. So before we start on this pathway, we know we've got low blood volume, we know we've got low blood pressure. Just as a little side note, I want to say that the liver naturally produces something called angiotensinogen. So that's just a little side note that will help you put all this together, okay? So what happens? We've got low blood pressure. The next thing that happens is this decrease is picked up by the kidneys, and the kidneys release renin. Okay, so we've got low blood pressure, kidneys release renin, which essentially is a protein. So kidneys release that, and then the renin acts with the angiotensinogen, and it gives us angiotensin 1. Okay, now angiotensin 1 is inactive until it gets to a certain point. So this is inactive until it gets to the lungs. Now when angiotensin 1 gets to the lungs, it's converted into angiotensin 2. So it does that via something called ACE, which is the angiotensin converting enzyme. So kind of nice and easy to remember. So we've got low blood pressure, causes the kidneys to release renin. Renin reacts with angiotensin that the liver produces, and we get angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is inactive until we get to the lungs, where ACE turns 1 into 2. So now we've got angiotensin 2. Now angiotensin 2 is the good stuff, there's nothing inactive about this. So angiotensin 2 acts as a very powerful vasoconstrictor for our arterioles, okay? Alright, hope I haven't lost you too much there. And angiotensin 2 also causes a release of a hormone, okay? So this releases aldosterone. Okay, so vasoconstricts arterioles and it releases aldosterone. So it releases that from the adrenal cortex. And what this hormone does is it acts on the kidneys and it basically tells them to retain water and sodium. And with that, it leads to increased blood volume and therefore increased blood pressure. Now the above sequence here takes about 20 minutes to come into action if you're normally healthy. So I just want to go through it again. Let me just, aldosterone, I can't spell. Causes renal retention of sodium and water. Okay, so I just want to pop through that again. So liver naturally produces angiotensinogen. If we've got low blood pressure due to dehydration or a hemorrhage or loss of blood, anything like that, triggers the kidneys to release renin. Renin acts with angiotensinogen to give us angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is inactive until we get to the lungs. And then in the lungs, the converting enzyme converts angiotensin 1 into 2. So now we've got angiotensin 2. 2 acts as a very powerful vasoconstrictor for arterioles, and it also aids in the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. And aldosterone causes renal retention of sodium and H2O, so water. And that in turn will increase your blood pressure. So what about the opposite of the angiotensin pathway? We've got the ANP pathway, not ANP with Emily, but ANP, okay? And this is a hormone as well, just like aldosterone. And it's the response triggered when we have high blood pressure. Okay, and this is triggered from the atrial walls, so the pressure in your atrial walls, if it becomes too much, and that's too much high pressure, that releases the hormone ANP. And what this does is it acts as a vasodilator. So it acts as a vasodilator, so you remember that the angiotensin 2 acts as a vasoconstrictor. This one, because we're wanting the opposite effect, it acts as a vasodilator of that. Okay, and what it essentially does is it promotes the kidney to release sodium and water. Okay, and obviously if we were retaining it last time with the angiotensin, we're now releasing it, so that means that our blood pressure is going to come down. Alright, so you've got two hormones there that work oppositely but very much in the same way to achieve different things. So ANP is for high blood pressure and angiotensin is for low blood pressure. And just before we go, I want to talk about the normal ranges of blood pressures. Now that's a bit of a tricky topic because you can put as many subcategories in that as you like: children, adults, males, females, older generation, anything like that. But in general, if you're looking at systolic over diastolic. I think they say the generically good blood pressure will be 120 over 80, or around about that, okay? Anything over about 140 is considered high blood pressure, and for me, anything below 100 at work, I would be flagging as low blood pressure, certainly below 90. That's not a good place to be in, so lower would be under 100 systolic, and higher would be sort of above 140 systolic, okay? But yeah, about 120 over 80 is the generic normal for systolic over diastolic, and then under 100 I'd be flagging as potentially low blood pressure, and over 140 I'd be flagging for high as well. But always make sure you do your background checks, ask them whether they suffer from high blood pressure or low blood pressure. Ask them what their normal is. Most people will know what their normal is, and if it's out of that range, then take note of that and make sure that you include that in your decision-making process as well. All right, so that wraps up blood pressure for today. We will see you again next time. Next time we're going to go on to the musculoskeletal system, or maybe the nervous system. I haven't figured out what one to do yet, but I did get a question in the comments in a couple of videos ago asking to go through things like these degrees that I'm doing, so the access to medicine and also medical schools, and so I'm going to have a little chat about that, and if you want to watch it, go for it. If not, it will be on the channel anyway, just for people that are interested. So yeah, that will be my last video before we break up for Christmas. I hope you all have a really lovely Christmas, and I will see you in my next video. Bye from me and Kenny. Thanks.